The lawyer's office smelled of lemon polish and endings, but I wasn't prepared for the end of my entire life. My husband's last will didn't just disinherit me, it revealed I was never truly his wife at all. The air in Mr. Davies' office was thick with the scent of old paper and lemon polish, a smell I'd forever associate with the end of things. I smoothed down the front of my black wool dress for the 10th time, the fabric feeling scratchy and foreign against my skin. Everything had felt foreign for the past 2 weeks, ever since the phone call that had cleaved my life into a before and an after. Before, there was Mark, my husband of 15 years, with his booming laugh and the ridiculous way he'd hum off-key while making coffee in the morning. After, there was just this, a suffocating silence in our big, empty house and the sympathetic, pitying glances of strangers. Mr. Davies, a man whose jowls seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 last wills and testaments, gave me a watery smile. "Thank you for coming in, Jane. I know this is difficult." Difficult didn't even begin to cover it. It was impossible. A cosmic error. Mark was 52. He played squash twice a week, had the cholesterol of a teenager, and had promised me we'd grow old and cantankerous together on a porch somewhere overlooking the sea. A massive heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon wasn't part of that plan. It felt like a betrayal, a final cruel joke from a universe I no longer understood. I just nodded, unable to trust my voice. I was expecting this to be a formality. Mark and I had no children. His parents were long gone, and his only sibling, a sister in Australia, had already emailed to say she wouldn't contest anything. Our assets were all joint, our lives completely intertwined. This was supposed to be a simple, heartbreaking affair of signing papers that would legally erase him from my life. Mr. Davies would read some legalese, I would cry quietly into a tissue, and then I would go home to a house that was no longer a home, but a museum of a life I used to have. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked, each second a tiny hammer against the fragile shell of my composure. "We're just waiting for one other party," Mr. Davies said, shuffling some papers on his vast mahogany desk. I frowned. Another party? I thought it was just me. "A last-minute addition to the list of attendees," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. Mark was very specific in his final instructions. Before I could ask who, the heavy oak door swung open, and there she was, Eleanor. It was like a blast of Arctic air had entered the stuffy room. I hadn't seen her in person in over a decade, but you don't forget the woman your husband left for you. She was the before to my before, the first wife, the one Mark always referred to with a sigh and a dismissive wave of his hand as ancient history. But she didn't look like history. History is supposed to fade. Eleanor looked like she had been sculpted from ice and ambition. While I was draped in the shapeless sack of a widow's grief, she was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit so sharp it could have cut glass. Her blonde hair was swept back in an elegant chignon, not a single strand out of place. She wasn't here to mourn, she was here for a board meeting. Our eyes met across the room. I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck. What in God's name was she doing here? Mark had sworn up and down their divorce was clean, if bitter. He said they hadn't spoken in years, that he'd paid her off handsomely and she'd vanished from his life. Eleanor's lips painted a bold blood red, curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was a smirk, a slow, knowing, triumphant smirk that made the hairs on my arms stand up. She glided over to the chair opposite me and sat down, crossing her long legs with an audible whisper of expensive fabric. "Jane," she said, her voice smooth as silk and just as cold, "you're looking, well, under the circumstances." I couldn't form a reply. My throat was tight, my mind racing. Why was she here? What could she possibly want? Then my eyes caught a flash of light, a blinding, prismatic sparkle. It came from her left hand, which she had placed deliberately, almost theatrically, on the arm of her chair. On her ring finger sat a diamond. It wasn't a subtle diamond. It was a weapon, a monstrous cushion-cut boulder that looked like it could fund a small country. It was ostentatious, garish, and breathtakingly large. It was also undeniably new. I had seen photos of her from her time with Mark. Her original engagement ring was a modest princess cut, nothing like this behemoth. This was a statement. This was a declaration of war. I stared at the diamond, then back up at her face. The smirk was still there, wider now, practically dripping with condescension. She knew I was looking. She wanted me to look. She wanted me to ask. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Now that we are all present, we can begin. He looked down at the document in front of him, his face pale. He seemed deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his gaze fixed on the papers as if they were a life raft. I, Mark Richard Peterson, he began, his voice wavering slightly, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. My heart hammered against my ribs. Codicils? Previous wills? This was all news to me. Our will was simple, drafted 10 years ago, one document, everything to the surviving spouse, clean, easy. What had Mark done? Eleanor just sat there, serene, a predator waiting for the trap to spring. She casually adjusted the monstrous diamond on her finger, the light catching its facets and throwing tiny, sharp rainbows across the room. Mr. Davies continued, his voice droning through the standard legal preamble about debts and funeral expenses. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and a rising, sickening dread. The diamond, the smirk, her presence. It all felt connected, a puzzle I couldn't solve. Mark loved me. He told me every day. We were happy, weren't we? The lawyer took a deep breath, and the air in the room seemed to crystallize. He finally looked up, his gaze flicking from me to Eleanor, a look of profound apology in his eyes. Now, he said, his voice barely a whisper, we come to the primary bequests, as outlined in the final codicil to this will, which was signed and notarized 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. My blood ran cold. 3 weeks ago, Mark was alive. 3 weeks ago, he had kissed me goodbye before leaving for the gym. 3 weeks ago, he had been changing his will. As per this codicil, Mr. Davies continued, reading directly from the page, his voice trembling now, I hereby acknowledge and reaffirm my marital vows to my one true partner, and... He paused, swallowing hard. The silence stretched for an eternity. He looked directly at Eleanor, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Mr. Davies finished the sentence. To my wife, Eleanor Vance. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. My wife, Eleanor Vance. For a moment, my brain simply refused to process them. It was like hearing a sentence in a language I didn't speak. It was static, noise, nonsense. Then a bubble of incredulous laughter escaped my lips. It was a raw, hysterical sound that startled even me. I'm sorry, I said, looking at Mr. Davies, my voice trembling between a laugh and a sob. I must have misheard you. Did you say Eleanor? That's a typo, surely. A terrible, cruel typo. Mr. Davies' jowls seemed to sink further into his collar. He looked down at the document as if hoping it would spontaneously combust. There is no mistake, Jane. The wording is precise. Precise? My voice rose, cracking. Mark was my husband. We were married for 15 years. We have a marriage certificate, for God's sake. We have a life. A life built on a rather shaky foundation, it would seem, Eleanor purred from across the table. She hadn't moved a muscle, but her presence seemed to expand, sucking all the oxygen from the room. She examined her perfectly manicured nails, a picture of bored indifference. I turned on her, my grief momentarily eclipsed by a white-hot flash of fury. What is this? What game are you playing? Mark couldn't stand you. He hadn't spoken to you in years. "Oh, darling," she said, finally lifting her gaze to meet mine. Her eyes were a glacial blue and utterly devoid of sympathy. Men say all sorts of things, don't they? Especially when they're trying to keep the peace at home. She held up her left hand again, wiggling the finger with the blinding diamond. "This isn't the ring of a man who couldn't stand me. This is the ring of a man who finally came back to his senses, to his real wife." "I am his wife," I practically screamed, shoving my own hand forward, my simple gold wedding band feeling suddenly flimsy and cheap. "This is real. Our marriage was real." "I'm afraid not." Mr. Davies' voice was soft, laced with a pity that felt like acid on my skin. He slid a folder across the polished desk towards me. "Mark came to me about a month ago. He'd discovered something, an irregularity." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the folder. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, stamped and dated over 15 years ago. Court filings from his divorce. Words like dissolution, decree nisi, and filing error swam before my eyes. "What? What is this?" I whispered. "There was a clerical error in the final filing of their divorce decree," the lawyer explained, his voice gentle but firm, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. A box unchecked, a signature missing from a final docket. It was never caught by the court. Legally speaking, the divorce between Mark Peterson and Eleanor Vance was never finalized. The room began to spin. Never finalized. The words echoed in the cavern of my skull. It couldn't be true. It was a nightmare, a detail, a technicality. "So what does that mean?" I asked, my voice small, childlike. Eleanor answered before the lawyer could. "It means, Jane, that your marriage to Mark was never legally valid. You were never his wife. You were, what's the term? His long-term mistress, I suppose. It's rather tragic, really." The smirk was back, a venomous slash of red across her pale face. 15 years. Our wedding in the little chapel overlooking the coast, our honeymoon in Italy, the anniversaries we celebrated, the Christmases, the quiet Tuesday nights watching movies on the sofa. All of it. A sham. A legal fiction. I wasn't Jane Peterson. I was just Jane. The woman who had wasted 15 years of her life living in a fantasy. My mind raced back over the last few months. Mark had been distant, preoccupied. I'd chalked it up to stress at work, a big project he was trying to land. He'd been taking late-night phone calls in his study, closing the door when I walked in. He'd had several business dinners on evenings he was usually home. I had trusted him, implicitly. The thought that he had been seeing her, reconnecting with her, planning this. It was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The diamond on her finger wasn't a recent gift. It was the culmination of a long, calculated betrayal. So this codicil, I stammered, looking at Mr. Davies, begging him with my eyes to make it stop. "It gives her everything?" "Not everything," he said quietly, flipping a page. "Mark was specific. There are several personal items and a monetary sum set aside for you. A severance package." That's what it was, a pathetic little payoff for 15 years of my life. Eleanor let out a delicate sigh. "Let's just get to the important part, shall we, Mr. Davies? I have a lunch reservation." The lawyer's eyes met mine one last time, full of apology, before he dropped them back to the will. "Very well. Regarding the primary marital assets, specifically the property located at 125 Willow Creek Lane, its contents, and the surrounding land. My house. Our house. The house Mark and I had bought as a shell and renovated room by room. The garden I had planted, the kitchen where we danced, the bedroom where we had loved and fought and dreamed. My home, the only sanctuary I had left." Mr. Davies took a deep, shuddering breath. "The property, having been purchased during the legal and unterminated marriage of Mark Peterson and Eleanor Vance, is designated as a primary asset of that union. As the surviving legal spouse, full and sole ownership is hereby transferred to... He didn't need to finish. I already knew. My world didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. The air left my lungs in a silent scream. I wasn't just a widow. I wasn't even a wife. I was an occupant, a tenant on borrowed time. Eleanor stood up, smoothing the front of her impeccable pantsuit. She looked down at me, my entire life collapsing in a heap in a lawyer's chair, and her expression was one of pure, unadulterated victory. "Don't look so distraught, Jane," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she picked up her designer handbag. "I'm not a complete monster. I'll give you until the end of the week to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises." The phrase, "vacate the premises," echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the office. It was so clinical, so impersonal, the kind of language used for squatters or pests, not for the woman who had spent 15 years building a life within those walls. Something inside me, something that had been frozen solid with shock, finally snapped. I surged to my feet, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. "No," I said, the word a raw tear in the fabric of the room. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was low, guttural, animalistic. Eleanor, already halfway to the door, paused and turned, an eyebrow arched in amusement. "I'm sorry?" "You are not throwing me out of my home," I snarled. I took a step toward her, fueled by a rage so pure it burned away my tears. For a split second, a flicker of something. Was it surprise? Fear? Crossed her perfect features before the mask of condescending pity slid back into place. "Darling, it was never your home," she cooed. "It was always, legally, mine. Mark was just borrowing it, along with you." I lunged forward, not at her, but at the desk. My hand shot out and snatched a random file from the stack in front of Mr. Davies. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care. It was a piece of this nightmare, and I was taking it with me. "This isn't over," I whispered, my eyes locked on hers. She just laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was more insulting than any shout. "Oh, I think it is. Have fun packing." And with that, she swept out of the room, leaving behind the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the wreckage of my life. I don't remember the drive home. It was like my mind had detached from my body, floating somewhere above the car as my hands and feet went through the motions of steering and braking. The familiar streets of our neighborhood looked alien, distorted, as if I were seeing them through warped glass. The cheerful mailboxes, the manicured lawns, the kids' bikes left on the sidewalk. It was all a scene from someone else's life. When I pulled into the driveway, I just sat there for a long time, staring at the house. Our house. The dark blue door I had spent a whole weekend painting. The rose bushes I had planted by the porch, their buds just starting to show color. From the outside, it was unchanged. It was still my home. But Eleanor's words had poisoned it, turned it into a facade, a movie set where I had been the unwitting star in a tragedy. Finally, I forced myself out of the car. The key felt heavy and foreign in my hand. It slid into the lock with its usual click, a sound that had always meant comfort and safety, but now sounded like a cell door locking me in. The moment I stepped inside, the chill hit me. It wasn't a physical cold, but a deep, profound emptiness. The air was stale with betrayal. The photos on the console table, U.S. in Paris, on a beach in Mexico, laughing at his sister's wedding, they weren't memories anymore. They were evidence of a lie. I walked through the downstairs rooms in a daze. Every object was a fresh stab of pain. The lopsided clay mug I'd made in a pottery class that he insisted on using every morning, the worn spot on the arm of his favorite chair, the faint, lingering scent of his aftershave in the upstairs hallway. It was all still here, but he wasn't. And the man I thought he was had never existed at all. The man I thought he was wouldn't have done this. The man I thought he was wouldn't have let me live a lie for 15 years. The man I thought he was wouldn't have been sneaking around with his ex-wife, buying her diamonds, and secretly rewriting his will to leave me homeless and destitute. The rage returned, a tidal wave that drowned out the grief. I stormed into our bedroom, my eyes scanning the space, reevaluating everything. I went to his closet, the place that was most uniquely his. I pulled open the door and was met with the neat rows of his shirts, the orderly line of his shoes. I started pulling things from the shelves, not knowing what I was looking for. A letter? A secret phone? Anything to explain this monstrous deception. My hands tore through stacks of sweaters and boxes of old ties. I was crying now, hot, angry tears that blurred my vision. It was hopeless. He had covered his tracks. He and Eleanor had planned this, meticulously. They had probably laughed about it. Laughed at me. The thought made me want to be sick. I reached up to the highest shelf, a place where he kept old college yearbooks and memorabilia I never looked at. I was about to give up, to just collapse on the floor and let the despair consume me. My fingers brushed against the rough wood of the shelf, and then something else. It was cold and small. Tape. A piece of packing tape holding something to the underside of the shelf, tucked away in the deepest corner. My heart hammered against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I tore at the tape, pulling free a small, flat object. It was a key, a small, old-fashioned brass key, the kind for a diary or a small lockbox. I looked back at the shelf. Tucked behind a stack of photo albums, almost invisible in the deep shadow, was a small, dark wooden box. It wasn't his. I had never seen it before in my life. It looked old, antique, bound with tarnished brass fittings. My breath hitched in my throat. My mind, which had been a maelstrom of grief and anger, suddenly focused with a razor-sharp intensity. This was it. This was something he had hidden, something he didn't want me to find. I slid the box from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked. The key fit perfectly in the small, ornate lock. I hesitated for only a second, my mind racing with possibilities, love letters from Eleanor, secret bank documents, something, anything that would make sense of this madness. Then I turned the key. The lock clicked open with a soft, metallic sigh. For a moment, I just stared at the box, my hand hovering over the lid. A part of me didn't want to open it, terrified of what final, brutal truth lay inside. But the alternative living with the not knowing, with Eleanor's smug victory as the final chapter of my story, was unthinkable. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and lifted the lid. The contents were not what I expected. There were no bundles of passionate letters, no secret bank statements, no damning photographs. Instead, the box was lined with faded red velvet and contained just a few, seemingly random items. On top lay a single yellowed photograph. It was a picture of Mark, but a much younger Mark, maybe in his early 20s. He was standing on a porch somewhere, his arm slung around a young woman. It wasn't me, and it wasn't Eleanor. This woman was a stranger, with dark, curly hair and a shy, beautiful smile. They both looked impossibly young and happy. I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink were 2 words, Lakeview 91. Beneath the photograph was a small leather-bound journal. It was worn, the corners soft with age. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover, MP Mark's journal. I'd never known he kept one. He was not a man for introspection or sentimentality, or so I'd thought. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, sprawling handwriting, but the words belonged to a man I didn't know. He wrote about law school, about feeling lost, about a future he couldn't quite see. And then he wrote about her, the girl from the photograph. Her name was Sarah. He wrote about meeting her the summer after his first year of law school, about her laughter, about the way she saw the world. It wasn't a teenage crush. The pages were filled with a deep, soul-shaking love that was both beautiful and painful to read. It was the kind of love he had never, not once, shown me. Our love had been comfortable, companionable, easy. This was elemental. I flipped through the pages, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. He wrote about their plans, their dreams of opening a small bookshop by a lake, of a life far away from the corporate law track his father had set for him. Then, the entries became more sporadic, more anxious. There was a mention of his father's disapproval, of pressure, of a fight. And then, abruptly, the journal ended. The last dozen pages were blank. What had happened to her? To them? My mind was reeling. This was a side of Mark I had never even suspected existed. He had presented his life to me in neat, edited chapters. A privileged upbringing, law school, a brief starter marriage to Eleanor, and then me, his real life, his happy ending. But this journal, this photo, suggested a whole volume had been ripped out before I ever came along. Beneath the journal was a thick manila envelope. My name, Jane, was written on the front in Mark's hand. Not to my darling wife or for Jane, just my name, stark and impersonal. My stomach twisted into a knot of dread. This was it. This was the message from the grave, the explanation I had been both searching for and fearing. I tore it open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper and a key. Not a small brass key like the one for the box, but a modern silver key. A safe deposit box key. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, the same day he signed the codicil that destroyed my life. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the lines of his familiar script. "Jane," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am gone. And you have likely had a very, very bad day. I can only imagine what Eleanor has put you through, and for that, I am truly, deeply sorry. There is no easy way to say this, so I will just say it. Everything you learned today at the lawyer's office is a lie. Well, most of it." I had to read the sentence twice. A lie? My mind struggled to catch up. "Our marriage is real, Jane. It is legal and it is valid. The story about the clerical error with my divorce from Eleanor? A complete fabrication cooked up by her and her shark of a lawyer. The divorce was finalized 16 years ago. Our marriage certificate is ironclad." A wave of dizzying relief washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. I wasn't his mistress, our life wasn't a sham. But the relief was instantly chased by a flood of confusion. Why? If our marriage was legal, why had he signed a codicil naming Eleanor his wife and giving her everything? It made no sense. I kept reading. So why did I do it? Why did I sign everything over to a woman I despise? The answer is in this box. Her name was Sarah. She was the love of my life, long before I met you or Eleanor. We were going to run away together, but my father, he interfered. He paid her off, told her I didn't want her, and forced me into a marriage with Eleanor, a woman from a family he approved of. I was young, weak, and I buckled. I've regretted it every day of my life. The pain in his words was palpable, a ghost reaching out from the page. A few months ago, I found out the truth. Eleanor knew about Sarah all along. In fact, she helped my father orchestrate the whole thing. But that's not the worst of it, Jane. The worst of it is what she's been doing for the last 25 years. The key in this envelope is for a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of City Central Bank. The box is registered under my name. In it, you will find everything you need, all the proof. Don't trust Davies. He's her man. Don't trust anyone. Go to the bank. And Jane, forgive me. I did this to protect you. It was the only way. Protect me? How was leaving me homeless and heartbroken protecting me? What could Eleanor possibly have on him that was so powerful he would detonate his entire life, our life, to appease her? The letter raised more questions than it answered. I looked at the key in my hand. It felt like the key to everything. The proof, The truth. The weapon I needed to fight back. My grief and confusion solidified into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't a victim. I was Mark's last resort. His chosen soldier in a war I didn't even know he was fighting. I grabbed my purse, the safe deposit key clutched tight in my fist. I had to get to that bank. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew one thing for certain. Eleanor's victory was going to be short-lived. I walked out of the bedroom, my purpose clear, my stride firm. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard a sound from the living room, a soft click. I froze, every nerve ending screaming. I hadn't turned on any lights. The house should have been silent. Slowly, silently, I peered around the corner. Standing by the fireplace, silhouetted against the dim light from the window, was a large, unfamiliar man in a dark suit. He was looking at the mantelpiece, at the photos of me and Mark, and in his hand he was holding a crowbar. My blood turned to ice. My first instinct was to scream, to run. But Mark's last words echoed in my mind. "Don't trust anyone. I did this to protect you." This man wasn't a random burglar. Eleanor had sent him. She wasn't just content with the house. She was looking for something. The box. She must have known, or suspected, that Mark had left something behind for me. My terror was instantly replaced by a cold, protective fury. I backed away from the stairs as quietly as a shadow, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The safe deposit box key felt like a burning coal in my hand. I couldn't let him find me. I couldn't let him get the key. I slipped back up the stairs, my feet silent on the thick runner, my mind racing. The front door was blocked. I needed another way out. The small window in the master bathroom. It led to the narrow roof over the sunroom with a thick trellis of wisteria running right down to the garden. It was risky, but it was my only chance. I didn't grab anything else. No wallet, no phone, just the key. The man downstairs started moving, the floorboards creaking under his heavy tread. He was starting his search. I didn't have much time. I scrambled into the bathroom, locked the door, and wrestled with the old painted-shut window. For a heart-stopping moment, it wouldn't budge. I put my shoulder into it, gritting my teeth, and with a painful crack of dry paint, it finally gave way. Cool evening air flooded my lungs. I climbed out onto the roof, my stockinged feet slipping on the slick shingles. Below me, the garden was cast in long, deep shadows. I could hear the man now, moving around in the bedroom, drawers being pulled out and slammed shut. He was getting closer. Taking a deep, ragged breath, I swung my legs over the edge and grabbed onto the thick, woody vines of the wisteria. My hands scraped against the rough bark, my dress snagged, but I didn't care. I scrambled down, half climbing, half falling, until my feet hit the soft earth of a flower bed. I didn't look back. I just ran. I ran through the back gate, down the alley, and didn't stop until the streetlights of the main road felt like a safe harbor. I flagged down a taxi, the driver giving me a strange look. A woman in a rumpled black dress, face streaked with dirt, hands bleeding slightly, but I didn't care. "City Central Bank downtown," I gasped, clutching the key so tightly my knuckles were white. The bank was closing in 30 minutes. The entire ride, my mind was a whirlwind. Eleanor hadn't just helped Mark's father break up a young romance. It had to be more. Blackmail. Something illegal, something she had held over Mark's head for years. And Mark, the brilliant lawyer, had found a way to fight back. A final, intricate gambit from beyond the grave. The fake codicil, the public humiliation. It was all a performance for Eleanor's benefit. He needed her to believe she had won, that she had everything, so she wouldn't suspect he had left me the one thing that could destroy her. I practically fell out of the taxi and raced into the bank. The safe deposit vault was in the basement, a cold, sterile room of polished steel and hushed silence. I presented the key and Mark's death certificate, my hands shaking as I signed the access log. The attendant, a prim woman with stern glasses, led me to a small, private viewing room and left me with the long, heavy metal box. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no treasure, no cash, no jewels. There was just paper, stacks of it, a thick file, meticulously organized with Mark's precise, legal mind. The top document was a sworn affidavit signed by Mark and dated the same day as his letter. As I read, the full monstrous truth unfurled. Sarah, the girl from the photo, hadn't just been paid off. She'd been pregnant with Mark's child. Mark's father, a man obsessed with legacy and bloodlines, had panicked. He and Eleanor had conspired to get Sarah out of the picture. But they didn't just send her away. They had her committed, using a corrupt doctor to falsify a diagnosis of severe mental instability. They had stolen her child. The rest of the file was the proof. Copies of the fraudulent medical records. Bank statements showing huge regular payments from a shell corporation owned by Eleanor's family to the doctor and the private institution where Sarah had been held for years. And the final devastating piece of evidence, an original birth certificate for a boy named Daniel, listing Sarah as the mother and Mark as the father. And tucked behind it, forged adoption papers, signed by Eleanor, placing the week-old baby with a private out-of-state agency. She hadn't just taken his first love, she had stolen his son. The payments from Eleanor's company had continued for 25 years, keeping Sarah locked away and silent. But the institution had closed down a few months ago, and Sarah, finally free, had found Mark. That was what had changed everything. That was the secret he had been carrying, the late-night calls, the distraction. He had been reconnecting with Sarah, and together they had been searching for their lost son, and they had found him. The final pages of the file were printouts from a private investigator, photos, a current address, a biography. Daniel was 25 years old, a happily married architect living in Oregon. He never knew his real parents. Mark knew Eleanor would be watching him. He knew that if he died suddenly and left everything to me, her lawyers would tear my life apart looking for a reason. They would have found out about Sarah and Daniel, and they would have buried the truth forever, painting Mark as an adulterer and me as a fool. So he created the perfect diversion. He gave Eleanor exactly what she wanted. He let her think she'd won the house, the money, the final victory. He made her feel so secure in her triumph that she wouldn't look any further. He sacrificed his own reputation and my short-term happiness to give me the ultimate weapon. I sat there in the silence of the vault, the cold steel a stark contrast to the burning rage and profound sorrow in my heart. I thought of Mark, of the weight he must have carried, of the desperate, brilliant plan he had concocted in his final weeks. He hadn't betrayed me. He had trusted me. He had trusted me to be strong enough to see it through. The next morning, I didn't go to a lawyer. I went to the police and the district attorney and the top investigative reporter at the city's biggest newspaper. The story was a firestorm. Kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy. With the evidence Mark had gathered, Eleanor's carefully constructed world imploded. Mr. Davies was disbarred. Eleanor and her father were arrested, their smug faces plastered across every news channel, the monstrous diamond on her finger now looking like a gaudy shackle. The will was invalidated, the codicil thrown out as a product of coercion and blackmail. The house, our life, everything was mine. But it didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. A week later, I flew to Oregon. I sat in a small coffee shop clutching a worn photograph of a young man with a familiar laugh in his eyes. A man named Daniel walked in, looking nervous but kind. He had his mother's smile and Mark's thoughtful brow. I slid the photo across the table, along with a letter Mark had written for him. And as he read, and the tears started to well in his eyes, I began to tell him the story of his parents, of a love that was stolen but never forgotten, and of a father who had given his last breath to make sure his son would finally know the truth. Standing in my sun-drenched living room a month later, packing away Mark's things, the grief was still there, a constant, quiet ache. But it was different now. It was no longer poisoned by betrayal. I had fulfilled his last wish. I had given his son the truth and his first love her justice. My marriage hadn't been a lie. It had been the final, most important chapter in a much larger story. And I had been the one he trusted to write the ending.